we've got a little bit of time here. So again, if you would throw to you guys, if there's any particular questions that you have of Greg and Sammy on their presentations, but also just more broadly speaking, any of the issues that are coming up for you in regards to anything that's gone through this morning. We've got a gentleman over here.
Offsetting. This looks like an extremely arduous task, given that the private sector is involved and won't be very enthusiastic about going through the offsetting process. How in practice are you going to operate offsetting?
With regard to obtaining the offsets, we're in negotiation with the Biodiversity Conservation Trust to act as a delivery partner for us. We're looking at sites that are identified for offsetting will be private land primarily, but there's also an opportunity for council-owned public land to become part of it, and also two lands that are owned by the government already through the Office of Strategic Lands are also interested in participating in offsetting. So these are lands that are identified, will generate a credit value from their initial start state as to what they can be improved towards. The improvement is costed, as I said, in credits. The credits are identified for what's community is to be restored at that site in that particular vegetation zone, and that cost of those credits is borne by the developer through the purchase of the credits. So in effect, for the impact that they are having to degraded lands and degraded communities, because we've been very stringent in how we've applied the requirements under the Biodiversity Conservation Act of avoid, in the first instance, minimise the impacts that you then have and offset the residual. Through going through that process, we've identified how many credits we are looking at requiring from the Cumberland sub-region to provide for that offset.
Good. Interesting.
Okay. Do we have another? We have one over here, thank you.
John Moen. I'm just curious, a lot of us are practitioners here. I'm not sure how many people are on the other side of the demand-supply equation, but I'm just wondering if there's any work being done to educate the demand side, given that we've got a lot of people with a lot of knowledge who would definitely be prepared to respond to that demand. We've talked about price, we've talked about supply, we've talked about lots of availability of hard-to-find species. I'm just wondering, Paul or Martin in particular, perhaps, but is that coming from? Is anyone doing any work to educate the demand, whether that be government or landscape architects or local government? Is that a thing? Because we're all here to be educated, but it seems to me that that's the two parts of the same question.
Look, it is a huge thing, and one of the issues is that the assumption that you can buy seed off the shelf, and so many people are in the demand equation. It's the last, and I'm guilty. I go back, I can think 30 odd years ago, I was involved in an experiment, and it involved narrow-leaved hotbush, one of the most common weeds in Western New South Wales, or woody weed species. And I didn't even think about getting the seed for the trial because it's so common. Went to a seed collector, no, don't have it. So look, I was guilty of it, and it's taken me years to understand and that somehow we need to, yes, educate, make people aware, but build into it the communication networks between the various operators to free up the systems and have these longer timelines for project development. I think we're starting, but I still think we're a long way off. Yeah.
Martin, would that, again, a great question, because often we're polarised. As you say, we're practitioners here, and then you'll get a forum where there's lots of researchers and not many of us, or vice versa. Martin, would the Healthy Seeds program consider running workshops, for example, for particular groups to try and raise their awareness of issues?
It's one of the things that has come up, and it's I think we've got to think of what's the most effective mechanism for building the understanding and awareness. That's one. I think videoing newsreel things. Isn't that old school newsreel? God Almighty!
Could
something on things on landline.
Yeah.
Just building awareness. But I think it's certainly one of the things that we need in healthy seeds is how do we link the supply-demand equation and what's the most effective way of getting that information to those who need it.
Might it be something for Regen TV as well?
I think the fact that today is being recorded is a mechanism to get, and this forum is a mechanism for exchange of that sort of idea and where are the gaps. I hope that we will have more solutions, but that's the idea.
One of the questions I'd like to ask is, are there any landscape architects here? Fantastic. Two. Really, this is an area of great creativity, and in some nurseries we're getting demand from landscape architects that's actually pushing away from the local ecosystems. We need landscape architects who are engaged in this conservation issue, who can push some of the ornamental aspects towards the conservation issue.
I'm going to quickly address your question too. One of the things about the conservation plan is that it does bring to a single point, if you like, or at least a very small subset, the majority of what is going to be required for in those areas. So instead of having to deal with, I think last count we're talking 40 odd different developers who hold lands in those areas that we've identified, it'll be all dealing with what we coordinate through the CPCP to be able to prepare. And one of the documents that I'm preparing is the recovery plan. So that is part of, it's the restoration plan. I did the recovery plan for far too long, that's just another story altogether. The restoration plan is going to be identifying clearly what is required, what the situations are. We're looking at 10 different recipes, if you like, for what you're starting with, what your milestones are to finish with, those sorts of things. So it's clearly identifying in there what the requirements are that's going to say, if you're starting in this condition, this is what we're hoping to get to. It may require a series of these recipes to build to the end, but we don't expect it to be just one, but that whole coordination opportunity that we're providing is where we're going to get a lot of what you're asking of, that coordinated, that single view that is taking in both the developer side, because in reality, the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, as the proponent of the CPCP, is acting as a developer in saying, this is what we want, this is where we need to get it, and this is how we need to get it.
Sam was just going to add a point, but I'd just like to add to that in terms of coordination, there's got to be coordination. The issue that I'm struggling with is what scale the coordination is in various parts of the state and who is involved in the coordination.
Just one other point. In a previous iteration of Flora Bank, there was actually a training package for seed purchases, and that was something that was being rolled out in the early 2000s, particularly in WA in the mining sector. So I think there is an education package there, and that might be something that comes up as part of the refresh of Flora Bank.
Look, we've got one of the architects of that, Dave Carr's in the room. I don't want to put you on the spot, but actually I'm going to. David, do you have any comments about where we got to with Flora Bank, with a sort of a sector-wide training framework, with sort of information sharing? All that seems to have sort of subsided now. Is there any way we can start rebuilding that from your point of view?
Well, there's still a Flora Bank training package that we developed in the second iteration of Flora Bank, which was aimed at professional seed collectors, and it incorporated a lot of the science from all the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, which was going on at the time. That package is still available. Steve Field and I have been running that training package for the last 10 or 12 years. It included that component that you're talking about, Sam, the training for a component for seed buyers or seed users to understand what they're actually buying. It's quite quite a comprehensive package. It's a 4-day course. We've modified it down to 2-day courses, 1-day courses for people who've never seen a pair of secateurs in their life, up to people who are, planting seed supply for really large scales like what you're talking about, Greg. I think that would be a really high priority, I think, for the Flora Bank review, is to bring that up to speed and make it available to a few more people. There'd be a lot of people in this room who could use that package and teach it, and would be great benefit to all these sectors.
I think, Martin, it might be less to do with coordination and more to do with triggers, signals, so I've got a question for Greg, for example. I'm one of those signals, and it plays into John's idea about end users, the demand side of things. So, we mentioned fire and planting. I wonder why, I guess it's not an exhaustive list, but why wouldn't seeding be part of that technique? If we're looking for a signal...
Seeding is that ameliorative planting that I was talking about, so bulking up to get the diversity.
Actual direct seeding. So.
I consider that to be planting as well. John.
Yeah, look, we talked about landscape architects, and some of the biggest fights I've had with restoration in Western Sydney has been with landscape architects and the landscape architecture industry. I actually think that there is huge amounts of land that gets landscaped by people who have very little connection to the value system in terms of conservation that I think most people in this room subscribe to. And there are some notable exceptions, so I'm not trying to damn the lot of them. But that's a lot of money. That's a lot of investment in plants and in seed. And I would suggest that if we're going to be realistic, we really need to be getting into the landscape architecture industry and the landscape architecture training for faculties, and actually trying to get some actual conservation value into those faculties, rather than having a situation where we not only have inappropriate plantings, but we actually have awards being given to landscape architects who plant weeds in new landscape developed areas, and councils and officers having to spend money then dealing with the fallout from that award-winning landscape planting.
Let alone what's coming in the way of climate change and inducing things to become less sleeper and more active.
I just wanted to add to that as well on what John was saying. It's not just landscape architects, but in a lot of instances it's ecological consultants that are writing these plans that have unrealistic timeframes, particularly when we're talking about seeding. But then they're just answering to the demands that the planning authorities are putting on them. And the proponents in that case, I'm not talking about large proponents like some of the national parks and the likes, but the little developers, who then tend to put out the contracts to the civil contractor to manage. So, Tina, you were talking earlier about making sure that contractors have an accreditation system, but by and large, contractors are filling out a plan that they're given.
Responsive.
And if the plan is bad to start, then we should be looking at the people who are writing the plans.
Okay,
rather
so
than the
there would
contractors
need to be an
themselves.
accreditation for the planners as well.
Absolutely,
Yeah, we've actually
yeah.
been talking about that for a while. But on the landscape architect issue, I'd like to mention that the Society for Ecological Restoration Australasia worked with 13 partners to develop the national standards for the practice of ecological restoration in Australia, and the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects was one of the partners. Now, what we need is there's been a fair amount of indifference from that partner. What we need are champions who are members of that organisation to champion the standards. So can we get that idea out?
In my experience too, the plans can be a little more iterative than what they first appear. So, it shouldn't be back on the contractor to do it, but in my experience, if you do question plans with the right stakeholders.
Well, that's the point though. With the wrong stakeholders, they won't listen to.
Yeah, sometimes they do.
Well, not for sure, but I mean, particularly in Western Sydney, where there's not this great opportunity for large-scale restoration. There is in places, Western Sydney Park, there's National Park. There are some big areas, but by and large, often the contracts we get given are a small development with the owner that owned the property for years, and now they're deciding to develop it, and they engage Joe Blow, who's put the ECA on his business card, and they get the civil contractor to engage that, and they don't want to hear you. They don't want to hear you engage with that, and those little fragments are so important. But they're not getting access to the information that we all have here. So how do you get this message that comes out at every Armour forum we come to, and we're all on board here? How do we get it to the people that just aren't ever going to don't even know what Armour stands for?
But even at local government level and state government level, to stipulate that a requirement in some of these developments is probably a sound thing.
And if these things are linked to, for all its faults, but for its benefits, if these things are linked to, and I'm not suggesting in your case that they were, but if they're linked to offsets and the gain is only recognised upon evidence that it has worked, then that would hopefully dissuade people who are, and I've worked with exactly the same people. I mean, some of the sites I've worked on that have been abject failures are because of the horrible fights that, non-listening that you've had to have with clients who want stuff happening tomorrow. But if there is an incentive to create a financial outcome that is sufficient to override their normal impulse of wanting things to work tomorrow, or to walk into a shop and buy, 400 kilos of pure Themata for, $400, then perhaps we'll start working down that path. Where it becomes more problematic, I think, is outside that area where there is a market, where there is a clear financial gain. And in all those little council reserves or roundabouts or, sort of outside the offsetting system, I think that remains one of the big areas. How do we incentivise restoration? And again, some people maybe heard me talk about it. I don't want to bang on too much, but in the United States, there are a number of really well-established programs that create, including offsetting, but it's one of the smaller ones, that create opportunities and incentives for farmers to restore on their land, for roadside departments and operators to do that native restoration, and for people in urban areas, landscape architects and people, city planners, to be implementing natives in urban structures. So I think somehow we have to start looking and trying to draw in what are those sort of incentives that are working so well in other parts of the world. Offsetting is a great opportunity for us here, but on its own, it will just be one great thing and everything else won't work. So we need to really try and get momentum going across the board, in my opinion.
For those who are in local government or closely associated to local government, I would also recommend looking closely at your DCPs and seeing what you can amend or identify in your DCPs to ensure that this sort of thing occurs, because that is where you will get the traction.
Yeah, that was sort of similar. That might be the technical part of what I was thinking, which is long-term land managers should be asking people to up the ante. So we've had great opportunities with national parks where we've had developers impacting land, and national parks have said, no, spraying out exotic cover crop isn't good enough. We want you to do something better. So where the long-term land manager is also the compliance or the regulator, then there is an opportunity to say, no, we expect more. And I suppose that then sends a signal to us as people in the market that there is a market to do this high-quality work.
And what both of those, Sam, some of the critiques you can make of those plans that you're expected to execute is in fact the other way, where they're actually unrealistic as well. They require short time frames and high native abundance and low weed counts, so you do have to lift the bar, but at the same time you need to understand, a consultant or an abstract idea needs to actually be mindful about soils and seeds and plants and weeds and disturbance, the succession of plants, how it actually works. It can actually work the other way as well, where it's unrealistically onerous in terms of how quick and how good some of these processes are.
Yeah, it's true. Realistic is probably the word, really, isn't it?
Do we have any other questions? Oh, sorry. Nola? Sorry, no. Up the back here. Sorry, thank you.
Hello. How are you going?
Good.
Look, I'm listening to all these talks, and we hear about conservation and all this stuff, but I'm not hearing enough about actually using local provenance to the sites. Like, someone mentioned the EC, the Banksia scrub, and specific genotypes to that location. That's something I'm really interested in. But just that mixing of all these populations, like, that has me a little concerned. It has, are we looking at the potential for some of these populations to be unique species, or is that being overlooked?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we were talking this morning a little bit about the whole, the team was talking about the whole sort of local is best paradigm has really been challenged in recent years. But I guess it really depends on the space you're working, particularly if you're working, it sounds like you're probably working in an endangered ecological community and looking at the components of that. So in some of those situations, probably local, might be best. But I guess for a lot of us in the restoration industry, we're also looking well into the future, and I guess this whole concept of what we're restoring has to be climate ready, and so in some cases we're factoring in climate change over 50, 100 years timescale. So we're starting to think maybe doing composite provenancing or bringing in genotypes from outside of the local area, or even in the northern part of the state, for example, might actually be a sensible strategy. So this is a very dynamic area of thinking in restoration.
Can I just add to that? But it seems to me like that's, like, I feel like that should be like a last line of defence. Don't you guys think that? Like, if it seems to me like already non-local stuff is being used all over the place anyway, and we're also assuming that these local populations couldn't survive this climate shift. But just last year I've got a habitat pond. I've got rainbow fish from northern New South Wales. They all died. We're talking about a pond system that's been established for about 4 years. We had a record cold winter, and then I'm hearing, about genetics being moved from the north to the south. We're assuming the climate's going to do certain things, and we're also assuming that local populations couldn't survive.
Very good point. Yeah, really good point, I think.
I just want to add, like, we've got all these seed banks. Why not use them? And then if we have to move those genes into those locations, at any time you can go straight to that bank, put them in. But no one's actually collecting seed from these local remnants and storing these seed. Instead, we're talking about broad-scale collections and mixing these things up before we understand what we've got.
We need to tease this out a little bit more, because when talking about a local population, we're not necessarily talking about something that's close to the receiving site. A population could go for many tens or hundreds of kilometres. That genotype or that population may not have a narrow distribution, or it may have, and this is why we need genetic information on those species and genotypes. And Restore and Renew is working towards that. So I think it's very important not to mistake the idea of a local population and a seed source that is geographically very close to a site. So what my talk was referring to is avoiding collecting seed from a source very close to a site if there is already a chance of, if already the numbers of individuals is small in that area, because genetic diversity can't be represented by a very small number of individuals. There are other people here who know more about this than I, but we need to be thinking, like, just one thing that really did impress me was that the reason we don't run around planting near intact ecosystems and bringing things from long distance away to make them climate ready is because they already have high levels of connectivity and gene flow and a large sized population, and there's a chance that they may actually in their gene pool have genes there that are capable of adapting. So we're not doing it to native ecosystems that are intact, and they're our models for restoration. The only reason we would bring in seed from other areas is to supplement the broad genetic base in respect to the fragmentation issue. And that can be seen as something to be looked at initially and then look at climate as well. But in reality, if a large gene pool can help to allow a population to adapt to climate change, then we need to be focusing on just increasing the genetic diversity of that population rather than bringing material in from too far away. That's my point of view, but I think there are other people like Nola here who might have some improved interpretation of that. But you get what I mean.
I do. I would love to chat with Nola as well, like on a separate issue, but
we can make just as much a mistake just collecting from very wide sources on the assumption we're doing the most scientifically informed thing. I mean, we can make just as bad mistakes as collecting them too close.
Some of these species that you talk about are self-pollinating, so this, if we're talking about low genetics, like how do you know that the population didn't already naturally have a low genetic diversity? Like you look at these islands in the Pacific, one seed gets there from a bird, and then maybe 1,000 years later you've got a whole new species, but that all originated from one plant that was able to self-pollinate itself and then colonise the whole island. So I'm confused by this whole notion of this inbreeding thing and this. If everyone worked together, like if Tian, you mentioned with that Banksia scribe thing, to get residents to plant local provenance plants from that sort of nearby area, you had a map there. If everyone was doing that, you'd end up connecting all the remnants anyway, just via people's backyards. That's enough for me.
Yeah.
And there's sort of two sides of the risk and two different types of areas to apply that risk assessment to.
Is there a microphone for Tim?
I think there's a red Banksia scrub sort of situation, and then there's probably grey box woodlands on the Cumberland Plain type situation. There's the risk of getting integrity wrong and not using local provenance, and then there's the reverse risk of large areas of the Cumberland Plain to be reconstructed, or the ambitious plans of recovery plans or restoration plans across large geographic areas. So therefore there's the risk of not doing it. There aren't these seed collectors out there off their own bat storing seed banks from every remnant in every area just in case. There just isn't. And there's a big task to achieve in Western Sydney. So you do need to recognise both sides of the risk profile. One is integrity, but the other is the magnitude of what's to be done. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but...
I think that really... Is that on?
Yeah.
I think you're right about the two ends of risk, but there is also, I think, the seed survey would indicate that there's transfer of seed going on anyway, beyond anyone's control, without the level of coordination and knowledge. So, it's already happening. What we've got to understand is what are those risks? Where are the population and genetic issues that may emerge? And if they are if they are identified as being critical, coming up with systems of support with the knowledge and the background science of where it's critical. But at the moment, it's just a hodgepodge, quite frankly.
The thing that struck me from Paul's talk, though, was that in all likelihood the demand is coming from the city and the supply is coming regionally. And that could be for a range of reasons, but one of them could be that our desire to coordinate and our desire to regulate and our desire to protect actually impinges on the availability and ease of access for this precious resource called seed.
That may be
so the end users go further afield to solve their problems.
Yeah, well, I think the market dictates that approach. That's my view, because I hear a lot of, I get inquiries for seed all the time, and you get to hear where the batches are going and why, and it's what I would call market failure.
Yeah, but the regulation and restriction.
There's no regulation. There's no regulation.
Well, so but you can't just go and collect anywhere you like, whenever you want.
Yeah.
I don't know what planet you're living on.
Well, you shouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
No, but look, that's what we're saying. There are a whole lot of flaws in the system, things that don't work, things that should work, things that we think are working and not working. And even this discussion, I think, highlights the elephant in the room, that there's a whole lot of things that are happening regardless of what our beliefs, understanding, knowledge and science is telling us.
Yeah. And again, a very valid point to raise. And maybe it is someone like Maurizio at Restore and Renew that we generate a list of particular species of interest, and maybe this Banksia is one of them. To what degree can
species
that
and
be
regions?
mixed?
I think we
Yeah,
can pin down some species and regions where there's likely to be risks and identify things. We don't need to do everything, and we'll never be able to do everything. We don't have the money for that. But we've got to start to identify that, and it's not a case of controlling the market. It's a case of informing the market and getting some understanding of what's trying to be achieved, and that supply, because it's all interrelated. That supply-demand thing.
Great. Look, can we go to another question, Steve? It's coming that way, mate.
Okay, Steve Field. I can't speak to the Sydney. I can't speak to the entire Sydney region. I'm from Western New South Wales, up around Armidale, and work west and south and north from there. What I'm hearing is a lot of sort of middle of the industry rising, but what we've got, seeds for the future and healthy seeds, we have to go back, I believe, and educate collectors and give them the tools that can provide seed into this sector that will capture all the knowledge that they have in a database form, in collection form, that will be able to be utilised later and read. We'll be able to read how seed values are changing, how the climate is affecting distribution of plants, general health of populations, and I think that for me that's where we need to start. We need to get educated collectors of an ethical nature out there, and then provide good quality seed, which largely isn't available. I'm sure I deal a lot with seed. We have a seed bank. We have 2 very big refrigerators and a laboratory and a scientist to run all of that. But I have purchased seed on behalf of my customers, and the seeds come back and it just wasn't worth purchasing at all. So there just doesn't seem to be standards out there from that bottom up.
Yeah. And that was one of the key findings of the native seed survey, that overwhelmingly the recipients said that there was need for the establishment of a native seed body to represent the sector, and also through that standards of practice. So that's certainly something that resonated.
Putting on one of my former hats, I worked out the other day, in the last 30 years I've worked for 14 different agencies and 5 different jobs. It's just a little bit scary. But in doing that, one of the things that I have done along the way is worked on cleaning and doing a lot of checking of the Bionet data. And in working with that group there under Bionet, it was very clear that there's a lot of people out there who are collecting under licence, who are not complying with their licence and putting all their records into Bionet, into the Wildlife Atlas, to ensure that that record is available. If you're worried about accessibility of that record to the general public, that's fine. You can actually put records in that maintain a closed access, a limited access situation where it's just to you and now the OEH, or sorry, DPI officer, or officers involved with managing the biodiversity database. But if you're holding a licence in New South Wales, and you're required to have one if you are working in a critically endangered or endangered ecological community, and probably also too if you're working in a vulnerable ecological community. So basically, if you're working in Sydney, you'll need a licence. One of those licence conditions is that you put your data into Bionet regularly, and that data is critical for not just informing planning decisions and for informing the decisions on whereabouts things of interest are occurring, but also too for being able to coordinate source, supply, diversity information that we're going to need to make this work.
So just going on from what you said, Steve, about standards, I think that's going to be a key task for the Healthy Seeds project, definitely. Are you aware, or do you have any view of the work that's been done in Western Australia with the restoration industry? They're actually setting seed grade standards and have set up a framework. And Martin might want to comment on this as well. But that seems to be fairly progressive, what they're doing over there. They're grading it as conservation grade, commercial grade A, and different levels of quality. Have you got any comment on that?
I think anything that will bring a bit of structure into the seed collection would be welcome. It's at the moment it's just freewheeling, and I'm hoping that Martin and Paul will be able to put some brakes on it and give it a bit of form and functionality at the end of the Healthy Seeds project.
Just following on the Western Australian issue, some of the people involved in that are on the review of the Flora Bank guidelines and will be inputting into some of the panels, so that there is that interconnection. With regard, Greg, you're the first person I've ever met that looked at the data, which is really so that look, from the feedback that I've had from people, getting the data in is mind-bogglingly difficult. So I imagine extracting the data must be equally difficult. But I think one of the things, data and is really important. One of the things that I would like to hear from people here, the commercial people who are putting data in, one, and you don't need to name, well, I just get the impression that a lot of the data is not actually getting in there. I would be interested in those people that are here, what difficulties you have, and can it be streamlined? Can the system and the data, I think it's an area of improvement that we need to look at. Any other commercial people here?
Well, Martin, look, we're just about at lunchtime. Maybe this was a good sort of warm-up session because we're coming back really and we're throwing it over again. I think this has been a good one. We've highlighted a couple of these sort of key issues that we can tease out again. And again, there are no right and wrong. So again, I think we welcome anything from anyone here. And I know there are a number of people from outside the Sydney region here, from Canberra, from Victoria, the Northwest. So, and we can see already how interconnected this is. So it's almost pointless talking about this as being Sydney-centric because it's already connected and it goes the other way as well. So I would welcome any thoughts and comments. We would welcome any thoughts and comments in the next section from anyone in the room, whether or not you collect seed or you plant plants or you buy seed. Because again, the more feedback we get, the better armed we are to go forward to try and generate some sort of momentum around this. So I think let's break for lunch now. Could I ask you to just give everyone a warm round of applause?